All right. So today I'm here to talk about Starbeam. So that's something I've been working on for 6 to 9 months, something like that, with Tom Dale, who I created Ember with originally, and Chirag Patel, who worked on a bunch of Ember related things, but very behind the scenes. Um, and I think it's possible you've heard about it or I've heard me mention it. And so today my goal is to give you first of all, a bit of a sense of what it is, like what is Starbeam, and then like how does it fit into the future of Ember. So specifically, I think the biggest connection to Ember is that my plan, and I think nothing that I haven't done a good enough job with in the visuals of the slides here is like, what is my personal plan? What is an RFC? What is already done, etc. Definitely happy to answer questions. And also we'll try to fill it in verbally as I go. But basically everything in this talk is more or less my plan for the reactivity system in Polaris. And in case you're wondering, I also personally think that this is all achievable in the time frame that we have for Polaris, in large part because a lot of it, as I said in my keynote at EmberConf this year, is already done in some form or another. But Starbeam in particular is an attempt to put all those features in one place, and importantly, to make it work in systems that are not Ember. And I heard in the last talk, on the last panel, a bunch of people kept talking about the trend of making libraries that are generic, like somebody mentioned React Query, which is now can-stack query, React Table now can-stack table. And so there's a general trend of creating libraries that are generic and that get plugged into different frameworks. Starbeam is an attempt to make it like systematized, to turn the process of creating a library that works for all frameworks to make you not have to do all the work all the time, which means basically nailing down what is the universal definition of reactivity and how do you make it into a library. So before I start, there is one thing I want to differentiate, which is this talk is basically the full vision for Starbeam in the future, in the next year. Starbeam already exists today as a library. I made a screenshot here, but I figured I would also just go look at, here's the docs. This is definitely the best way to understand what Starbeam is right now. There's a lot of, I could geek out for a long time on it, but there's a lot of cool stuff here. Like the box have TypeScript hovering on it. Also, the docs this is just something I think the Ember docs could use. But automatically, if there's a difference between the JavaScript and TypeScript, it gives you the switcher. Otherwise, it does not give you the switcher, right? Because in most cases, it's the same. And that's also something Starbeam focused a lot on. Personally, I like the TypeScript APIs to do more inference and less having to write a lot of things in angle brackets, which is more of a pattern in other parts of the ecosystem. And so a lot of very few of the things of the examples actually have a switcher. It just sometimes when you're writing a function or something, it does that, right? So anyway, that's the story. I think if you want to understand the model, I think the fundamental section is pretty good. I think there's some diagrams somewhere here, I think. Not sure where actually, but one of these areas has a diagram that tells you what the validation rules are. The API section it already exists. And right now, the only thing that has a high fidelity renderer that is ready to go is React. But that is more or less a personal timing thing. There's a Svelte renderer that Chirag wrote that I just haven't had a chance to document. And as I'll say in a few minutes, there's a design for basically all the frameworks that we intend to support in the medium term. So basically, definitely, I think checking this out is probably a good way to understand what's going on. As it already exists. If you want to use Starbeam today, the docs here will help you do that. One thing I want to just point out, and which I'll get into more detail later, one of the goals of Starbeam is not just to make something that you can hack into an existing framework, but rather to make a design that really works well with all the frameworks. And we'll see in a few minutes what that means in terms of the design. But that, like in React, that means like really understanding what's going on with React 18 strict mode and stuff like that. So I think that's a differentiator. Like, for example, the prelock signals design, which just came out, is like a cool design. But if you go look at what the React adapter looks like, it's very like use the React internals, is not like a high fidelity thing. It's more like a proof of concept that that thing is possible. Whereas Starbeam is like very focused on making it work well in all frameworks, and I'll show some examples soon. Okay, so in general, what Starbeam is trying to do is to go beyond just like I don't know if people know, but like in the React ecosystem, there's things like Baltio, Zustand, Recoil. Those are like very data-oriented reactivity systems. And those reactivity systems don't generally provide a way of doing structure cleanup or providing a way of having in like something like an Ember service that is connected to an app instance, or general purpose modifier, right? So these are all things that if you are writing universal libraries that are meant to work in any framework, you actually need more concepts than just like a atomic piece of state that you maybe put in your module. So that was one of the goals, and the rest of this talk is me like working through each of these concepts and how it works. We already built the renderer for React and it works well. We already prototyped the renderer for Svelte, and we did the design work for Ember, Vue, and Preact. And I think that's, I'll say later, but that's the place where people can really help. Yeah, I don't like the rest of this talk. The React stuff mostly uses real world code. The Svelte thing uses largely real world code. The rest of them are like the design that we have in mind. Okay, so let's start with the most basic front end framework demo, which is the Hdmber counter. And this is basically code that you can see is importing from Starbeam, but doesn't actually just talk about any other framework, right? So we have a function here. That function makes a cell. A cell is basically a single piece of storage. And it returns an object that gets the current value of the count and allows you to increment it, right? So the important thing about this example is that this is a universal way of describing that counter example, including the method, the increment method, without having to refer to any framework. So what is it like? What does it mean? Like, how do we glue it into a framework? So actually, before I do that, like this is basically, if you don't look at the frameworks part and you just want to use this API, like it basically works like as if it wasn't reactive at all, which is more or less what the Ember design is, right? So yeah, so here's the example that I was saying out loud, but apparently wasn't on the screen, which is it's a function. A cell is just a single piece of state, and it returns an object, right? So this is just a little, it's a little reactive object that doesn't just talk about the, it doesn't talk about the framework at all. So now as to how it's used, this is like a very boring slide in the sense that there's nothing reactive going on here at all. But I think it is important to note that both Ember's reactivity, the track system, and Starbeam's reactivity don't ever make you wait for a set to take effect, right? So in a lot of other systems, there are various ways in which the reactivity gets batched or paused. So if you write to a reactive value and then immediately read from it, it doesn't always see the update. That is never ever true in Starbeam. In Starbeam, as soon as you write to a value, you immediately read it, which is what allows this very boring slide to make sense, right? Like from the perspective of Starbeam, the reactivity is a thing that is layered on top. It's how things get attached to the DOM, but the underlying APIs themselves are, you could write unit tests against them that don't know anything about reactivity and it would work perfectly. So, and in fact, we have unit tests for the JavaScript map, the reactive map, reactive set, those things that affect, like the basic ones just check that it works like a JavaScript map and set. And I think that's that's a critical aspect of the design. So now I'm gonna show React examples first, both because it's the thing I spent the most time on, and because I think it will help orient ourselves about what I mean by universal. Whereas if I show you Ember stuff, the first thing you're going to be thinking is like, oh, let me think about how that connects to the existing stuff. I have Ember examples for every single point, but I'm always going to start with React. So if you don't know React, I can explain what's going on, but I think it also doesn't matter that much that you like fully grok the code. So basically, the point that I want to make here is that there's something called a renderer in Starbeam, which is basically just a library that takes a Starbeam reactive value and glues it into a component or your whatever your framework is. And so in this case, we're importing a use reactive hook from Starbeam React. And that the reason we have a hook here is because the hook is idiomatic in React, and that's the general rule for reactivity for renderers. So the important point here, and the reason this example is a little more elaborate than it could have been if I was just trying to do a hello world, is that it is also really important for Starbeam renderers that Starbeam reactivity interoperates seamlessly with the native reactivity in the system. So in this case, React has a use state, and Starbeam has the counter that we showed in the previous slide, and nothing about using the use reactive hook prevents those things from working seamlessly together. That was something that took some doing, and I don't want to get into all the details of that, but I think that's an important design goal. So the point here is that we read from the counter whenever we want. We can make a function that builds on it, right? And then we can call increment, the method increment, and the thing we need to do in React to glue it together is to use this hook called use reactive. And use reactive basically just makes sure that React knows how to re-render whenever the reactive value changes. Okay. Similarly, Svelte has a pretty different design for the same thing, which is the use function. And the use function basically just turns a Starbeam reactive value into a Svelte store. And again, you don't have to know if you don't know what a Svelte store is, that's fine. But the TLDR is that a Svelte store is how Svelte natively handles external reactivity. So we want to turn the Starbeam concept into something that is native to Svelte. And the dollar counter is how you automatically subscribe to a Svelte store, right? So basically, this is just a normal Svelte code, and as far as anyone is concerned, like uses just a normal Svelte function. Finally, here is the Glimmer example or the Ember example. I'm going to use the template tag proposal and all the examples purely because it just makes it easier to write the examples. Obviously, anything that we're doing in here would work fine if you separated this template. It just would make the examples a little more annoying to write. So again, same thing. I intermix track state, like Glimmer track state, with the counter. I use the getter, which both gets the Glimmer counter and the counter.count. I have a method that does increment, and I can use the sum. So this is basically what you would expect from Ember, right? You would it would work. It is expected to work the same way as if you had written counter using the track decorator yourself. I may get into this more later, but I think one of the biggest open issues with Ember is Ember is able to interact with Starbeam in a native way that doesn't require subscriptions, because Ember has a nice validation model that is the same as Starbeam's. But right now they are two separate systems, and there's an open goal of making Ember and Starbeam, or Glimmer and Starbeam, share enough of the same underpinnings that this will just work. Right now, this would not just work because Glimmer tracking and Starbeam core are different. But that will not be true by the time Polaris ships. One thing that I think is good to point out is that we've been focusing on debug infrastructure from the beginning. That doesn't mean we yet have a great dev tool, although I on and off work on it. I'll show some screenshots in a second. But we've been focusing on making sure the whole thing is debuggable from the get-go. And I have some screenshots of just like demos I've shown people in the past. So first of all, there's a general purpose way of annotating any reactive value with a description. And then you can basically say, like, what are the dependencies on this particular reactive value? And like this actually is already in Starbeam, is like you can ask Starbeam to tell you the dependencies of any reactive formula. So that's pretty nice. And you can do work to annotate things with description information, and that will make this output clear. Also, like those links link directly to the part of the code where the value was created. And the whole system is designed to make sure that we don't end up in internal code. So that's good. This is an example, like a dev tool I was working on. I think I'm going to come back to it in the next month or two. But this is like basically taking that same infrastructure and printing it out like as you interact with the reactive value. And this is using the same infrastructure to plus a little extra to identify situations where you were supposed to have used reactive but didn't, and that would result in your code not in React. This is React infrastructure built on top of the core infrastructure. That will result in your code not updating correctly. And so this error is basically a very clear error message that points exactly at the places where you created the values and tells you exactly what you need to do to fix it. So generally speaking, the internals of the reactive system are have carefully plumbed through a debugging infrastructure that is designed to both produce good error messages and warnings, but also to allow us to build up dev tools over the next few months. I've said a few times, but the word render, when I say render, that is just the word we use for a library that glues Starbeam concepts into a framework. And the reason I use that word is I really want to focus on the fact that in Starbeam, everything is basically a value that is being rendered, and to de-emphasize the very effect-focused way that a lot of other frameworks think about reactivity. You'll notice that there's no effect in this entire presentation, but there are primitives that serve the same goal. So in terms of what are the core reactive primitives, I showed you cell already. A formula is basically the same as the Ember create cache primitive. It basically allows you to have a callback that invalidates whenever any of its dependencies change. And that's the thing where you can ask it to print out its dependencies, and we'll give you the list. And just like track built-in, Starbeam has object array map and set, weak map and weak set built in with the proper debugging infrastructure. I ported them. I didn't just copy them. And they have all the proper debugging infrastructure that tells you, for example, like what key in an object, what key in an app you're talking about, and things like that. I also showed the example where you have a function and you make a cell. This code here is already implemented in the Starbeam code base, but we're waiting for stage 3 decorators to land in TypeScript before we start pushing on this, just because right now, getting decorators to do what you want them to do in arbitrary build tools is non-trivial, and stage 3 decorators should really finalize that not being true, should finalize allowing us to use decorators as a real JavaScript feature. And once that happens, I think we'll basically want to say that there's the function version of these APIs and there is the class version, and the class, basically both versions have a constructor that have basically a version, a piece of itself that doesn't change, and the part of it that does change, right? So if you look at a class, right, the method never changed, but in a React hook, the functions could change unless you do extra work, right? So both the function version and the class versions don't require you to do extra things to make your function stable, if you are familiar with that in React. But they basically, I personally like the class version in most cases, but the function version has fewer dependencies on newer JavaScript features. And so we'll both of them are easy to support. Both of them work fine. And so I think that's basically that would be the story going forward, is that there's a function version, which you make the cells yourself and you use them. And there's a class version, which uses a decorator. Okay. I think the TLDR about all of what I just said is that the reactive primitives that come with Starbeam, the ones that already are there at Starbeam/core, at Starbeam/JS, are just the exact same primitives that are that Ember has, and also that Ember is slated to have in Polaris. Plus, create cache I turn the low level primitives at the higher level APIs, and I generally think that we need to write RFCs, but I generally think those are the right API designs for Ember. Okay, so that's reactive values. And I think that's really nice about reactive values, both in Ember and in Starbeam, is that if you just want to write code that deals with reactive values, and this is true about things like Ember Data or other data libraries, you can generally write a lot of code that doesn't ever think about subscriptions or writing .math or something like that. You can just write normal code. If you if you want to, like, I mean the like RxJS map or like the Svelte store derived signal, those kind of things. Basically, normally when you're just dealing with reactive values that don't involve any cleanup, you can just like write as many layers as you want, and then you just glue the end into your code. Basically, Ember users are familiar with this. It like what lets you make a class and put attract on anything you want, as long as you as long as you use it inside a component. And I think that, like that, it's a hard to explain benefit, but it's a pretty significant one. It's a pretty significant one in that it doesn't require a subscription and a teardown, a cleanup, or anything like that, just to use reactive state. However, there are situations that do require reactive state, like resources. So let's look at another canonical example of JavaScript frameworks, which is the like clock that ticks once per second. So a resource is not an effect in that a resource still represents a reactive value, but it also describes when you're creating it. It also describes how to set up and clean up the reactive value. So in this case, sorry, I thought I had some underlines here, but in this case, we create a cell at the top level of the resource definition, which contains the date. And at the bottom, we return it immediately. And what that means is that even if the setup never happened, the resource still has a date in it. Like the resource still represents a date. But then we also get to say, like, here is the setup, make a set interval, and then clear the interval, right? You get to write that code. And again, it's important to note, there's no importing from React or Ember or anything. You can describe the setup and teardown in a fully universal way. Now, I think what's interesting about this is that, again, this example looks like it's not doing that much, but let's look at what happens when, how you have to glue it into React. So something is not right. Okay. So it is important to note that, use resource is the React renderer way of getting a resource into your React code. And what it does is it basically just gives you the current value, it gives you the current value that we returned on the bottom, right? However, there's a problem, which is that we have 3 steps here, which is create the reactive value immediately. When the effects run, set up the resource. When the effects are clean up the resource. It seems simple enough, but there's a problem, which is the effects in React might not happen, or they may happen twice, and cleaning up might not be the last thing that happens, right? So this is not me trying to troll React. I think there are good reasons that the React team did that design, but it just means that if you just try to write it by hand using use effect, there's a lot of gotchas. So in order to help people avoid those gotchas, the React team created a strict mode in React 18 that basically does all these steps of development modes, which is render the component, render it again for no reason, run effects, clean up the effects for no reason, run them again. And it's just basically making sure that if any of those weird things happen, your code is resilient to it. I am familiar with this because I spent a lot of time and I have a lot of tests that make sure that the internals of the renderer work correctly. And in order to understand how it works, we can go back and look at the resource definition, and we can see that, okay, the part that rendering the component is the thing that makes the new cell. And the fact that there's no subscription here means that we can make the cell as many times as we want, and it just gets thrown away if the code gets rendered again, right? So that's a nice thing about this pattern. Then second of all, React is going to render the component again, no problem. Like I said, the cell gets created again. The first one got garbage collected, everything's fine. Then we run the effects, and again, it's important that we don't want to set up the set interval at the top level, because the cleanup code might never run in React. So basically, we wrote this design so that the setup code does the setup and the cleanup, and that's the code that, in the universal case, here's how you can guarantee that the setup and teardown actually runs, right? So that's what happens. Then React is going to call the teardown function, totally fine. We clear the interval, and then gratuitously, in strict mode, it calls the setup again. And the point of this whole API design is that, without you having to think too hard about it, this whole pattern results in strict mode in React behaving like regular, normal mode. And that's this is, I put a bunch of slides here just basically to say that this is what it means to be universal. It doesn't mean like figure out a way to hack it in. It means like go, like think about what the framework is actually doing, what it's trying to accomplish, and make sure that the API design for the universal thing actually can be glued in correctly. Okay. This is like roughly how it's going to work in Ember, which is basically like there's a use decorator, there's a resource function. I think like worth noting, it's built on the stable API of Ember Destroyable, and the Ember resources package, which someone mentioned in the last talk and is available and stable, is basically a prototype of the concepts that I'm showing here before we like glue everything together. And the like, this is my opinion, but I think like resources should be in Polaris. And I think broadly speaking, it is like a lot of things are built on them, and I think it will happen. Okay, Svelte, same deal again. We basically, like the use function works just as well with resources, and then it turns into a store, and that automatically sets up and cleans it up. So again, we have one general purpose definition that includes setup and cleanup, and the adapters glue it in. So that's the use function. Okay, so just to take a pause, so we had general purpose reactivity. We also had reactivity with cleanup. And now the rest of the talk is stuff that does not already exist in Starbeam, but we're in the middle of working on and builds on the previous concepts. So Starbeam also will have some service concept, and a service is really just a resource that is created for once for the entire application and cleaned up when the application gets cleaned up. So I actually won't have time to talk through this code in a lot of detail, but I tried to make a real kind of a real example here. So this is a resource at the top level, like we have the hypothetical example where we have a API called log socket, which basically is going to let us send log messages to the server. So at the top level, remember, we can't actually set anything up yet. We can't do anything that we need to get cleaned up. So all we're going to do so far is just like make a cell that has a status of idle. And I actually like this pattern a lot for creating resources that has something that makes sense at the initially, but then gets like upgraded instead of like null or something. It like does something meaningful. So we make it idle, and then we have a log function that's like always the same log function, and that just checks to see like if the status is idle, push it into the buffer, otherwise send it to the logger. And then, so then what do we do in the setup function? We connect to the socket, and then whenever the connection connects, we basically go through the buffer, we send the messages, and we set the socket, we set the cell to the new state. And then what we return, and then the cleanup function sets the status back to idle and disconnects the connection. Okay. So, but like, since it's going to be tricky, like you don't need to remember all that. Basically, the point is there's a resource. It is a general library that is not connected to any specific framework that allows you to log something to the server and also deals with the connection problem, right? And so how do you connect it to, and I think, so Ember has that concept, but how do we do this generally, right? So in React, the answer is there's a Starbeam provider component that you put in your app. Now, normally you don't need this, but because the whole point of services is that you only get one of them per app instance, you need to do something here. And this is the solution that is idiomatic to React. And now there's a use service. Use service basically works like use resource, but it only instantiates the resource once for the application that you're inside of. And only instantiates once for the application that you're inside of, and also manages the setup and cleanup for you, right? So you can think of it as being exactly like use resource, but it does the per app stuff that you want. And in this case, I just made an example of a form that like it's a log spammer. You like can send messages to the server for some reason. I just wanted to show an example of using it. Okay, so basically that's that. Now, what about Ember? So Ember is basically a similar thing. Like we already have an @service decorator. This is this is unrelated to Starbeam. I think the @service design needs to be able to take a thing that gets instantiated. So basically we pass the logger, and then it more or less works the same way. Like again, I'll add the slides up. You can look at it in more detail. but basically the TLDR is it like every render to say what the app is. In the Ember case, the app is the owner, like the Ember owner, and the Ember code is going to glue the service in correctly to the owner and get it to clean up correctly as well. Right. So Svelte is a similar story. Like Ember is like one of the only frameworks that has a built-in concept of the app. Everyone else uses some kind of context API. So the idea basically is that in other frameworks, we just put use the context API at the root to establish what the app instance is. And that will allow us to set up and clean things up. And then now we just have to use an idiomatic API in the framework. So in Svelte's case, it works just like use and gives you back a Svelte store, and dollar works. So there's a lot of code going by here. I think the important thing to realize is that all of these concepts are much richer than like I have some piece of atomic state here, but you still have an API for writing them in a way that's generic, that works in that can then be glued into all frameworks idiomatically. So that's like the overall goal here. I think Ember people know why we use services and not module state, but I think I just want to spell it out a little bit. I think what it means that you use module state for your application state is that cleaning up your application means like tearing down your code. And if you use module state, there's no actual tear down of a module. So there's no place to even register the cleanup code, right? I understand why it's like ergonomic in some sense to do it, but our goal is to make something that's like nearly as ergonomic as using module state, but allows us to have acceptance tests that run using the same code and cleans up the state over and over again, allows us to have server-side rendering that uses the same code multiple times, allows us to like clear all of our state to log out. And I think a lot of these problems can be solved by mocking modules or using some kind of module mocking system. And I think that's bad. And I think that's a good way of checking. If somebody says, oh, I'm just gonna use module state, if like 2 steps down the road, they're talking about mocking modules, then you know that they would have been better off with services in the first place. So anyway, that's like an Ember pitch for services. But the general point here is that we can use this resource concept plus like the renderer saying, here's what an app is, to basically get Ember services in any framework. And right now, services are not implemented yet. I mean, resources are implemented, but the renderer part that glues the application into a service is not already implemented. But we are imminently releasing Starbeam 07, and we're on a 6-week release cycle. Services are slated to be included in Starbeam 08. Here's the last part. The last part is modifiers. So modifiers are a concept that like also doesn't really exist per se in every framework, but having a function that gets glued into some element only when the element got created and has setup and cleanup is a thing that every framework has. Like Svelte calls it directives. React uses ref for that, right? Basically, everyone has something. Ember has modifiers. And so again, it's good to be able to write a general purpose, a universal modifier that then works in all the frameworks. So here's an example. Here's element size. So element size is a modifier. Again, notice it doesn't import from any specific framework, and it uses the same pattern again, right? So like at the top level, we set up a cell with status of rendering. And this is because in some frameworks, there is a gap in time between the point at which the modifier, quote unquote, gets created and the element is actually rendered and set up. And so when you write a universal modifier, you need to deal with that problem. So again, I like the pattern of having like what in TypeScript is called a discriminated union. So instead of using null, we use something a little richer. It works nice with TypeScript, but it's also clear, right? So we set up a cell with the status of rendering. The main difference between resources and modifiers is that the setup functions and resources take an element, and it's not an element or null. That callback only gets called once the element is actually set up. Also, unlike normal resources, modifiers have 2 options for setup timing: layout and idle. Layout is guaranteed to run before paint, and idle is not guaranteed to run before paint. And like more or less in React, that corresponds to use effect and use layout effect timing. And Ember actually doesn't have use effect timing. It only has use layout effect timing. And that's like a gap to close in order to map correctly onto these things. However, Starbeam is okay with running everything in use layout effect timing, i.e. before paint. It's just less performant. So I think like Starbeam lets you express that you're willing to let it run after the component was already rendered in cases where you don't need to affect the layout. But the renderers are not guaranteed to successfully do that. But like ideally renderers will eventually all do it. Like once we figure out how to make it work. And like we could make the render use set timeout or something if we decide that's okay. Inside of the setup callback, there's just a general JavaScript API called make a new resize observer, and the cleanup function disconnects, and then we set the cell to status of rendered, and we splat the get bounding client rect onto it. Okay, how do you use it in React? So in React, you say use modifier, you pass the modifier to it, and it gives you back two things. In React, it gives you back a ref, which is how you glue it into an element, and it gives you back the value that the modifier returned. And then then we say, okay, if the status is rendering, we just like print ... Otherwise we print the width and height. By the way, a lot of examples that are like, if you look at examples of React hooks that do this, they actually do use null, and they like either like assign it to 0 by 0 or something, or they just don't do it correctly at all. And I think it's good that like in React, there just is a time window here between the first render and when the modifier actually, like when use effect actually happens or use layout effect happens. And so it is actually important in React to distinguish and deal with it. And like there's just nothing to do about that. That's just like how it is. Like maybe we'll figure out a way of avoiding that ergonomically, but like I think in some sense it's fundamental. Okay. What about Ember? So Ember has a problem, which is that Ember does not currently have a mechanism for getting a value out of a modifier. This is a speculation about something we could hypothetically do. I think there would need to be a lot of syntax bike shedding, but I think the more I have worked with React, with other frameworks that do allow you to have effectively modifiers with values, the more I see it as a missing piece in Ember. And so I think we probably need to do something about that syntactically. And so that's like a gap in Ember. One thing that's worth noting is that Ember modifiers and Svelte directives are actually guaranteed not to have that gap in time. So when you use a Starbeam modifier in Ember, you don't need to worry about like that case. Okay. Now, just because I said, oh, it doesn't work in Ember, I want to show you, okay, well, Ember has modifiers and everyone doesn't, so what's going on there? Let's look at an example of a modifier that would work in Ember, like really quickly. So it's basically the same thing. It's an onResize modifier that instead of like giving us a value, just calls a callback, right? So same thing, makes a modifier on layout, sets up a resize observer and calls the callback instead of setting a value. This is like, I think the value version is better, but I think this is like what a lot of people do. And again, like inside of this is like a pair, right? So you need to set up the resize observer and the teardown inside the setup, right? One thing worth noting, I didn't get into this, but if you want to allow callback to be reactive, like if you want to allow callback to change, there's basically a facility for doing that, which is basically to accept either a callback, either a value or a reactive value, and then like merge them. And then in this, now when you get the value back, you just call the function. Okay. One last thing on this whole topic is that use modifier, use resource, etc. take in React, because like React has when you're working with React state and not reactive, like not Starbeam state, the way that you idiomatically deal with them changing is by passing a dependency array. So these APIs in React support dependencies arrays, and that like just means like when the dependencies change, that means that the modifier gets torn down and recreated just as if something else happened. Like basically using the same, we already declared in the modifier definition what setup and cleanup means. And so we're without any additional definition in the Starbeam side, we're able to like the Starbeam, the React API can take a dependency array and automatically manage the setup and cleanup for us without new universal APIs. Okay. Right. And then like, this is the thing that I think without new syntax design, like I think this would just work. There's a API in Ember called Modifier Manager, which basically lets you say like, here is how this random thing works like a modifier. And I think that's basically the glue between Starbeam modifiers and Ember modifiers, is to give them a modifier manager and glue it in. Okay. So just about wrapping up here. So the current status of this all, so that I just gave you a lot of things that you're probably like weren't aware of before. And it's like, okay, this is like very pie in the sky. So let me just get us back down to earth for a second. So the Starbeam library already exists today. We are on a 6-week release cycle. We have already released a bunch. 07 is shipping like imminently, like today or tomorrow. I think if you want to understand like what works today, or if you want to play with it, the docs are the best way to do that. I'm maintaining stack split starters for React that you can just jump to from the docs and play around with it. So like that is a good way to play around with it if you want. There's already a React render. It's in the code base. I maintain it and it works well and it keeps up to date. There's also a Svelte renderer that Chirag wrote. It is a little bit behind, but it also works. So that we're actively working on Ember View and Preact renderers. Like we have the designs and we just have to implement them. And that like basically the 1.0 plan, which is like, well, I don't know, like beginning of next year or something like that. Q1, let's say. The 1.0 plan is basically to have all these renderers done. Today, the renderers support the data flow and resources stuff. And the other pieces, which are services and modifiers, those are in active development and also necessary before 1.0. So by 1.0, which is like, again, Q1 2023, fingers crossed, we will have like renderers for the primary frameworks, integration with Ember, and data flow, resources, services, and modifiers as the fundamental concepts that you can implement. Okay, how does it fit in with Ember? So first importance, my opinion, I think what I mean by that is like a lot of other people care about what happens in Ember, and we have an RFC process and other people maintain things. So take it for what it is, but this is my opinion. My opinion is the very core, like Glimmer tracking, should be replaced with Starbeam core. That really should be a drop-in replacement. It should not be it shouldn't be a user-facing change. I know that like drop-in replacement probably creates like some triggering for some people. I think I understand that. I think we do the best we can. And I think we do like, at some point we have to be able to do something. And I think we do pretty well, but I don't want to get too super defensive here. I think that's just what it is. I think you can think of it as like Glimmer tracking 3. And I think that's what we should do. I also think like in terms of drop-in replacements, every time we've done it, we've gotten better at it being an actual drop-in, like ask people who are out for 113. I think like we've gotten better and hopefully this one will be like pretty straightforward. I think the Starbeam resources design, which already exists and is usable with the React renderer, should just be the resources design in Polaris. I have to write an RFC that says that, but I think it makes sense and I believe in it. I think if the RFC changes the design, that will just mean that we changed the Starbeam design. But I think hopefully that everyone will understand that there's a universal design requirement here. Right. And Ember resources exist today. If you want to play around with the resource concept, like it is built on Ember destroyable and all those things. It is very close to the actual Starbeam API, but it just will work today and be stable. I also think that we need to redo services because the string thing is not like really, for various reasons, it cannot be the only thing going forward. And so we need to have a way of like having a service that's a blueprint or something that we pass to at service. I think we should more or less adopt this design of building services on top of resources. I think that's still my opinion. It's still speculative. But I think part of what makes me bullish on resources is precisely that they end up being the underpinning of a bunch of other higher level things that I think that design should carry through. We also are already planning on making a manager API for services. And I think we should just make sure that it would support Starbeam services when we do that. Okay. So going back to Polaris, I think the big theme of Polaris in general, in my view, is to make Ember a great citizen of the bigger front-end ecosystem. So that includes like Embroider is like really stripping away a lot of what Ember's bespoke stuff is. Starbeam works separately. The template tag feature is going to be implemented as a general purpose extension to JavaScript that could work in other parts of the ecosystem, has contributors outside the ecosystem, just like Starbeam does. And so I think in general, the goal for Polaris is to make as much of Ember as possible something that could be contributed to and supported by bigger parts of the ecosystem. And Starbeam really fit into that. Like Starbeam really is the reactivity part of that story, right? So what does that mean? If you want to carry that story forward, what does it mean for reactivity? In general, like there's just a lot of chaos. Like it's like, oh, well, I work at a company, I need to support these other libraries. Like my company acquired somebody that uses React. How am I supposed to do that? Is it React 16 or React 18? Et cetera. Am I Vue 2 or Vue 3? There's a lot of chaos in the environment. And I think what people like about Ember is that Ember tries to bring some stability and order to the chaos. And a big part of what like Starbeam is trying to do here is to give you a way of writing a stable thing that has the same kind of stability story as Ember, but then just use it inside of other frameworks. And the renderer layer is going to absorb the chaos in the ecosystem. I've even had people from the React community say that they want to use Starbeam as a way of migrating from React 16 to React 18 because it seems easier to them than just migrating directly because of all the changes in the concurrent stuff. So, and because if you migrate through Starbeam, you get concurrent mode for like the concurrent APIs for free. Like all of the React Starbeam stuff is compatible with React concurrent APIs. So that like, it's just good to remember that even like, there's not even like, oh, we just use React and now we're done. Like React or Svelte or Vue all have changes over time. And so the idea behind Starbeam is like, there's an API that's like Ember stable, but it's very tightly focused on the activity and will let you build stuff outside of not just for Ember. And I think in general, like I think Broccoli is an example of something that in principle could have been a general purpose tool, but we didn't invest enough in making that true. And so it ended up effectively being an Ember specific thing that had all the constraints of being a general purpose tool. And I think like in general, we should try very hard for Polaris to disentangle ourselves from those kind of things. Either it's just like part of Ember period, or if it's supposed to be general purpose, like really investing in making it general purpose, which is why I spent so much time on the React adapter. So if you want to help, the Starbeam Discord is good. It's linked from the README. This is it. There are channels for all the renderers. Like here is the React render. Like it's people who care about React. Here is the Ember renderer. Like you can see that I have been talking about what we're doing. Definitely come check it out. If you're interested in like just getting in on the ground floor or something, like I think Starbeam, it's like 9 months old now. I think it proved out the concepts. You could definitely use it already. There's a lot of very exciting possibilities around like basically the kind of thing like tan-stack table, tan-stack query. There are Starbeam X packages that like prototype those things. And I think we can definitely build out like ecosystem of universal libraries. And like Starbeam is really designed to take advantage of how Ember add-ons, because they don't need subscriptions, like they're just data libraries, can really build a lot and not need to worry about like threading a subscription through all the reactivity. Like I know that's an abstract point, but trust me. And anyway, I think like basically, I think if you're interested in building stuff, you also don't need to wait for an Ember adapter if you just want to prototype stuff, because you can just build it, and you can just build it and play around with it. And if that's what you're motivated by, you just want to play around, all the APIs already work, right? So one last thing is, it might seem weird, like I didn't mention components, and I think I should just be explicit about the fact that the scope of Starbeam is everything up to the actual rendering. The reason for that is that the actual rendering is where like the framework, timing, concurrency, all that stuff comes into play. And that is not something that that's the part that you have to glue into, right? So it might seem weird that we can have modifiers but not components. But if you think about it, a modifier is just a JavaScript function, like more or less, that takes a element and does like normal JavaScript stuff with it. It doesn't, like the function itself doesn't have to care about any of the vagaries of component rendering. So I think it's interesting that we could like build libraries that have resources, modifiers, services, all of that without actually being a framework. What we cannot do is actually like have universal components. At least we haven't figured it out yet. And I have no leads on it. So anyway, that's cool. There's also like a vanilla renderer, which is basically like if you want to build up a renderer that's like pure Starbeam and is like not any framework, that's like an thing to play around with and is fun. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff to play around with. I am like very motivated to help people like get the code base in shape. I think if you're like, one last thing here, if you're interested in, if you're just interested in like documentation, there's a lot of documentation to write, and there's like a lot of cool infrastructure. Like, I don't know if this was on the screen before, but like the fact that like I already did a lot of work to make a lot of the, like, if you just go, like the way this works in the docs code is that you just have a TS file somewhere that has the code in it. It like actually has access to all the imports. So you're like writing a real example. And then without any, like if you're contributing Fox, without anything else, it automatically does all this stuff. It does the switcher and everything. So I think there's definitely space to like try to document stuff to help improve the documentation. I think just in general, there's a lot of space to contribute. There's of course space to contribute around the Ember work, although that's going to be like more advanced Ember user kind of thing. So anyway, there's a lot to do, and I'm excited that people help. I think I went way over, but if there's time for, like, if people want to ask questions and the organizers are willing to let me still be on the screen, then I'm happy to answer anything.
There are people in the chat with questions.
Yeah, I think I was answering the Angular question first, and then like,
Cool.
So I think the Angular thing is, I only didn't mention Angular because I started doing the design exploration of Angular, but I didn't finish it yet. And I want to be honest about what we did. Or I didn't mention Solid either because Solid also requires exploration. I like after Preact Signals came out, I did the work on, I did the design work on that. Right. So that's just, I think in general, like every framework that someone would think of, like I actually already did some design work on lit HTML. Like I think there's no reason why it wouldn't work everywhere. I think one thing to say about Angular and in general is the resources design, which everything above the core reactive layer is built on, depends on having a way of having a general purpose cleanup that is not like a method on a class. And most frameworks have it, but Angular still works like Ember work with will destroy. And it's very hard to shim it. Like you can try to use Rx observables or something. I didn't finish the design yet, but basically that is the thing that is tricky about Angular, is that Angular just doesn't have a way of, like the Ember destroyables design, of saying like, please run this cleanup function when this object got cleaned up without having to be a method. And I think like figuring out how exactly to shim it in is tricky. Lit HTML doesn't look like it has something, but it does. The host controller API. So like that's just the general work of getting a render done involves like finding the answer to a bunch of questions. Basically all modern frameworks have good answers to all the questions, but a lot of the long tail frameworks still look like Ember looked in 2015, right? I think that creates some challenges we'll figure out.
Cool. I don't think people here have questions, so maybe you can just read them from the chat and answer it to the people that are there.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So there's a general, like apps. Like I think I tried to answer the like, how is
the one about the comparison between Solid JS and Starbeam is, I think, an interesting one, and how it will help the Ember theme.
Yeah, there's like a cluster of questions about Ember that I can try to respond to. I like responded to it in a scattered kind of way, but I can try to do a more structured answer. But okay, so in terms of Solid, I think Solid and Preact Signals are a very similar design. I think the biggest difference between the Starbeam and Glimmer design and the Solid, like the Signals kind of design, and really everybody else, is that basically all other reactive systems other than Glimmer require subscriptions in order to get reactive values. And what that means is that if you want to derive values, you need some kind of API that's like derive parentheses or .map parentheses or something like that. You can't just like write a bunch of code that gets values and like works as if they were non-reactive code. React actually, React works like Glimmer and Starbeam, but without any pots, like with no granularity at all, right? So in React, the entirety of the granularity is the whole component, and there's no like basically there's and you still like basically the only way that reactivity happens is like the whole thing gets run again, and there's some ways of discovering that it changed. However, like React has the ergonomics of Glimmer and Starbeam in that once you're inside of a render function, you just like use regular JavaScript to construct new values. And that is how reactivity works, right? Whereas, and now everyone else is like, I don't like the performance characteristics of that. And the only thing that people know, like the academia work and like the general zeitgeist is, oh, you just have to use like the observable or signal like API, which is push based. But that the consequence of that is that you then have to like, you have to subscribe, you have to write derived functions all the way through. It's a little like, I always find it difficult to like prove it in a slam dunk way. But what it basically comes down to is like, if you want to write something like Apollo or React Query or something like that, it is very, very hard to write those things in a way that looks like normal JavaScript code. Like, oh, I have a map, I'll just change it for a track map. Those kind of patterns don't work in a push-based world because you have to glue together all, like you have to have a pipe basically from the source of the data all the way through to the consumer. Whereas Starbeam and Glimmer and React to a lesser extent, there's no actual pipe all the way through. There's just okay, inside of this block of rendering code, I know all the cells that were read from. And if any of those cells change without having to know anything about what happened in between, I can update it. I know I have to re-render, right? And it's like, basically it always has been since the beginning of Glimmer 2. It has been a middle ground between the performance characteristics of push-based, which is like very fast, but has a lot of ergonomic. It resulted in Ember in the reduced compute debacle, right? It will force you to have a lot of APIs that take the place of normal JavaScript array, filtering, sorting, whatever, right? So that it's in between the push-based world and the React world, which just doesn't have any validation at all. Like basically, if something gets re-rendered, there's no way, like there's nothing you can do other than like listing all the dependencies manually everywhere. So basically it's a middle ground. However, the performance characteristics of the Glimmer and Starbeam version are much closer to push-based than to the React side, right? So basically, from a performance perspective, it has a lot of the ergonomics of, oh, you just write JavaScript code to build up. You can build a whole library that looks like a normal JavaScript library and just look like it calls that filter. It like uses spreading maps, spreading sets, whatever, all that. But then the performance characteristics are very close to having very direct control over the pipe because of the validation system. So anyway, there's a whole page on the website that explains in more detail, and I do some talks about it. But I think like I said a lot of things here. The TLDR is that the ergonomics of solid and Preact signals intentionally look very close to the Starbeam design. But the reason that that's true is that demos tend to not build a lot of stuff up. They tend to be like, here's a piece of state and I'm using it inside of my component. And if you actually do try to build up, like my JS Nation talk on Starbeam does an example that is like that, then you start to see it, but it takes a little too much effort to build it up. Anyway, I think if you use Ember, you already know why it's good. And I think, I think let me give a very quick, like a short summary, like that summarizes what I just said, which is, it is very close to what people think they like about solid, but it doesn't, like, unlike solid, it doesn't require, there's no API for like batching. I think there's no API for batching and there's no API for like building a derived thing other than a function, right? So like that's nice. And I think I think the rubber meets the road where like whether or not we end up building an ecosystem of things like React Query. And I think we will. I think that'll happen. Okay. So I can also try to answer, I think I lost everybody, but I'll try to answer if anybody's still interested. Like, how does this fit into Ember? I'll just summarize really quickly. So basically how it generally fits into Ember is, I really think that Starbeam should just be like, replace Ember underpinnings, the internals of Glimmer that implement the same concepts. And I also think that the higher level concepts of modifiers and resources and services should ultimately replace, like without breaking, they should replace the Ember concepts. I think like that said, that's a heavy lift, and I don't even know if we'll do it in time for Polaris. What is very important is that the very core underpinnings, the like revision counter internally, the validation system, the stuff that you never touched directly, that stuff really needs to share the same code as Starbeam. Otherwise, Ember will be forced to, like, then you need to implement a subscription. You need something like use reactive in Ember, which would be a shame because there's no actual need for it in Ember. And the Starbeam design is the same as Ember. So I think the MVP of integration with Ember is getting the revision counter stuff and the low level stuff built in. That would mean that we could use the Starbeam implementation of track built-ins, which is like both more fine-grained than it without performance costs. It just does a better job of invalidating more on a more fine-grained basis. It also has all the debugging infrastructure in it, right? So like if we basically replace Glimmer tracking internally with Starbeam's core, I think more or less it's a drop-in replacement and would just let us use more Starbeam stuff. And I also I think for resources, modifiers, and services, like the Ember Manager design pattern, where we basically say, like, internally, we always go through an indirection. The indirection is can describe the old system. It can describe the new system. It can also describe third-party systems. Like that design pattern has served us very well. It's why Ember component and Glimmer component seamlessly interop, like without, like you can use angle brackets to invoke Ember, whatever, that whole story. That's because of the manager API. And so I think we already have Modifier Manager. We need to make sure he can properly work with Starbeam modifiers. We also need a service manager, which like basically all that means is that when you say at service blah, there, like right now, that would be hard coded to it is a class with a static create method. We need something else than that is more general. And then we would want to make sure that Starbeam, like if you say at service of a Starbeam resource, that it will work the way you would expect Starbeam services to work according to the Starbeam rules. And then modifiers, like we either need to do the syntactic design if we want the value stuff, or we need to do like a modifier manager glue for Starbeam modifiers. But I think basically in the long term, I think like Ember should just be built, just like Ember is built on Glimmer, the Ember should be built on Starbeam. Like it's just, it takes a slice out of what Glimmer's, like the Glimmer reactivity stuff, not the rendering stuff, and like swaps in Starbeam and gives us resources, services, etc. that are like compatible. They feel like part of the same system. I think that's what we want in the long term. I think in the short term, there's steps to get there. And I think by Polaris, I'm reasonably confident that we could get the internal swapped out so that we won't need subscriptions. We won't need extra boilerplate that you might need if you just tried to write an Ember renderer now. So, and I think the last piece of this question was, what is it, like, how does it help the Ember ecosystem? I think, first of all, like, I think one answer is the same way Glimmer 2 helped. Like, at some point, it's just good to improve the core infrastructure. And a lot of why I care is that. But also, I think, as I said at the end of the talk, it is very good for the Ember ecosystem to be built on components that have a constituency outside of Ember. And I think a lot of Polaris is about that. And so, like, I don't know what else to say about why it's good, but I think that for me, that is an important goal for long-term Ember community help, is to like try to make Ember share, like have a Venn diagram with a lot of extra constituencies doing a lot of work on Ember stuff. And that like means we should probably use a beat. Ultimately, we should probably like find a way to use the best in class tools that exist in the ecosystem. We use TypeScript, right? Because that helps us continue to exist and be successful and build an ergonomic framework that is like stable and all the things we like about Ember, without actually having to maintain it all ourselves, which we cannot do, right? So I think the real answer that I'll close with this, like, I think the real answer in general is there, like, when you are worried about Ember, you like forget the things you like about Ember. And I think, at least for me, I have no reason to stop working on Ember because I still like enough things about Ember that don't otherwise exist in the ecosystem, including the reactivity system. It's I feel like it's a French word, and I think At least that's what Evan said. So anyway, my rule of pronunciation, by the way, is like both for names and names of project. I just go find the YouTube talk where someone says their name out loud, and then I know it. I think that's a good trick. But anyway, I think the bottom line is that we really need to do that. There's still a lot of things I like about Ember. Yes, and it's true that Nuxt and Next exist, but I think even those things are like, for some reason, like Ember services is still a thing that is very core to how Ember people think about it, and not that popular outside of Ember, right? So there's basically ways of thinking about app development and ecosystem management and add-ons that are big in scope, but just like Starbeam, that otherwise is not a thing outside the ecosystem. And so I want to see Ember transition from basically being an oasis, a silo, to something that really brings forward our philosophy of having a scalable ecosystem that is built on more than just a moment in time, or more than just a certain reactivity system. It knows how to deal with DOM, etc. I want to do that without in a way that is sustainable for us on a maintenance level, right? So, and I think that's just the strategy. That's the Polaris strategy. And I think Polaris lives or dies, and also Ember lives or dies based, in my opinion, on whether we execute this strategy. Because I think I don't know how many more times I can rally the troops on something that is fundamentally really too hard for us to do. I think we just need to make it easier. I think this is the best guess I have. Okay, that's all. I think I answered all the questions. I guess someone said Starbeam focused on ergonomics. Yes, TLDR, yes, and but I think ergonomics includes ecosystem ergonomics, blah blah blah. Okay, anyway, great. It's fun being here. Thanks for all the questions, and I'll see you around. Hang out in the channel. Bye.